Okay, so in the previous years, I've recorded a couple of little video entries about how to do the case studies. I know people sometimes struggle a little bit with how to actually start the case studies. We talked a little bit about that in the lecture a couple of weeks ago, how to structure them, the process of starting them, and all those kind of things. Let me just say a couple more specific things now about the questions themselves. Hopefully this will be helpful because, if I give you a bit of a sense of what people have done in the past and some of the mistakes that they've made, then hopefully you'll avoid some of the same pitfalls and things. This actually helps me by doing a video like this as well, because then I don't have to answer 5 million emails over the next few weeks. So first thing I would say is I spoke to someone this morning and they came to me and they said, someone has said, yeah, we don't need to worry about the topics in the course guide. You just come up with your own question and do whatever you want to. Maybe I've said the wrong thing. I don't know what's come across in the lecture and things. But you certainly have to use the topics in the course guide. Okay. Now, you can probably adjust the question, that you come up with. You can tailor it a little bit to fit with almost any of those, or you can use almost any question to fit with some of those topics. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but it does actually have to fit with one of the topics on that list. So pick a topic, frame your own research question from that topic. Okay, so that's the first thing, just to emphasize that. Let me go very quickly through the things that are on the list already then. So the first question is all about the winners and losers of neoliberalism. And really the big idea there is that the theory, I suppose, behind quote-unquote neoliberalism is that everyone wins, I suppose, put it very simply. That if I as an individual or as a businessman or something pursue my own self-interest, I make as much money as I possibly can, I'm a manager of a business or something like that, then I produce revenue for the economy, I produce jobs, etc., 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 so everyone benefits. That's kind of the theory behind neoliberalism. So in some way, if you're going to write about that question, you might want to argue for neoliberalism and say, actually, that really does work. Here's some evidence that it works. Or you might want to challenge it and kind of say, well, that's not the case at all. And here's some big losers, perhaps, from neoliberalism. You might think about that in terms of the kind of the development debates as well. A lot of people in the past have written about neoliberalism, but on a kind of global scale when they think about the development agenda, millennium development goals, or the role of the IMF, the World Bank, etc. in development. So that might be one way of thinking about that. And oftentimes then what people are writing about is perhaps the unintended costs, or so as in something happens which is negative, but it wasn't meant to be negative, it just kind of worked out that way. It could be environmental damage or something like that. Or people have written about and they've said, well, the specific thing that the IMF did in this situation, they had a goal, and they really didn't care about the kind of the side effects, if you like. So you could do something like that. So that's the first question. The second one is all about the retreat of the state. As I said in the lecture last week, and please do remember this when you're choosing that topic, you don't have to just use a Western country. I'd forgotten to take that word out of the course guide. So you can do any country in the world if you want to engage with that one, with that topic, and the effects of globalization. But really what that question is asking you is about, the loss of state power. Do you think that states have lost power because of globalization, because of kind of global market actors or, big firms, multinational corporations, something like that? If that's how you were going to go about that question, then I think you should probably have two different things in there. One, you would need to show the loss of state power, the loss of, it might be state spending in the economy, the loss of state spending on welfare or something like that, but you'd need to show that. And then the second thing is you'd need to link that to globalization somehow, explain how that thing is linked to globalization. And that obviously, is connected to a whole range of different debates. In the lecture, we'll talk about this in a week's time. But that's linked to a whole lot of different debates. And for example, the constructivists, it's not that they don't believe in globalization, but they're much more interested in how politicians use the kind of the discourse of globalization. They talk about globalization like it's this this thing, this kind of, this power exerting itself on them. We have to do this kind of thing. We have to cut spending on the welfare state or whatever it is. But that's what the constructivists are interested in. But really, the retreat of the state is all about the loss of state power. Do you think that's happened? Can you show me a particular area where you think that has happened? The third question is all about money and finance, and what has changed in the world of money and finance. One of the traps people have fallen into in the past with that one is that they end up writing about a lot of details. They kind of say, I don't know, bankers used to be paid this amount of money, now they get paid this amount of money, or I don't know, regulation used to look like this, but now it looks like this, and that's fine. You do need some details in there, but really, the question is asking you, I suppose, in a sense, we've just lived through this huge global financial crisis, perhaps the biggest one we've ever witnessed in recorded history. Has the world actually changed? Has the world of banking and finance, has the world of, within the banks, has it actually changed? Has the world within, I don't know, hedge funds or wherever, fund management, has it actually changed as a result of this crisis? And then give some kind of evidence to support that either, yes, you think it has dramatically changed, or no, you haven't, no, it hasn't, but providing some evidence to make that big argument, I suppose, makes some sense. And obviously, again, linking that to the academic literature. Let me say something about the humanitarian intervention one. So let me spend a couple of minutes on this one. The big idea, the reason we put that question in a few years ago, was that the way that humanitarian intervention gets talked about and gets taught in most of the IR literature, it tends to be a kind of a sort of a kind of a morality or an ethical kind of question, responsibility to protect R2P or something like that. Questions of sovereignty or statehood. There's this crisis going on in this place. Should countries intervene? Do they have the right to intervene? Those are oftentimes the kind of questions that get addressed. What kind of intervention is required or is necessary, etc. in those situations. So the reason we, pardon me, put that question in there was to say, well, it's not just about the kind of morality and ethics. It's also an economic question. What are the costs of intervening or of not intervening? What did a country intervene because of the ethical considerations, or actually because they wanted access to oil or something like that? So those are the kind of the big broad considerations. In the past, people have tended to do one of two different things. They've either focused on the military type interventions, Kosovo, Iraq, etc., and then they might have looked at the costs to the United States of keeping armed forces in a particular place, or the costs to Kosovo or wherever, after 5 years or 10 years of an intervention, what happened to the domestic economy in a place like that. So there are those kind of military type interventions. But people have also looked at, I suppose, humanitarian aid interventions. Things like, I don't know. So the guy who will come give the lecture in a few weeks' time, he'll talk about Haiti. He'll talk about the earthquakes there. And one of the things that he'll talk about is how, after the earthquakes, loads of charities and NGOs and things like that, they arrived there to help solve and help the aftermath of the earthquake. But as they arrived, they brought with them all sorts of other unintended problems. So, for example, some of these charities or NGOs arrive, and then people who were previously working for the government come to work for these charities or these NGOs because they get salaries that are now 10 times what they used to be paid. But then all of a sudden, the charity leaves a few years later, and those people now they don't want to go back to work for their for their government anymore. They think, well, I'll leave. I'll follow the charity to Brussels or wherever because the salaries are higher and those kind of things. That creates an unintended problem. So there are loads of examples like that of charities or NGOs coming in, and then a sex industry, for example, springing up. Brothels that are set up around the camps of the NGOs and things to deal with the to cater for them, I suppose, if that kind of makes sense. So, thinking about those different questions, either you could do the military intervention type thing or the humanitarian aid type questions. And the final question on the list is about economic crises and the lessons you might learn from them. And again, a bit like I said with the the money and finance question. The key issue there is not to just list details. And it's not even really just to kind of, I mean, some people in the past have kind of said, well, there are 7 lessons to learn from this crisis or the Asian financial crisis. Let me tell you 7 lessons. And then, oftentimes when people have done that, they're not really talking about lessons. They're just kind of saying, here's something that happened, here's something that happened, here's something that happened. And it's, a bit like I said in the lecture last week, it becomes a bit of a shopping list of 1 thing, 2 things, 3 things, etc. So, questions you might think about if you're going to do that topic. Why is it, as we'll come to in the lecture, I think in 2 weeks' time, why is it that we're always in crisis? Why do we seem to go from one crisis to another? What's the connection, for example, between the kind of the economic or banking crisis and then the political crisis that a lot of countries are going through, and the rise of people like Trump or Brexit being on the agenda, those kind of things. Oftentimes, people have focused that case study on, even just one question. How was it that politicians or policymakers used a crisis? They said, there were situations that we couldn't deal with in the past, but now all of a sudden there's this crisis that's happened. We can make use of this crisis to bring about the kind of change we always wanted to achieve. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. Remember, you do have to use one of the topics on the list, but you can tailor your question to one of those topics. I would suggest that you take your case studies along, the plans and things along to the seminars. But if you want to see me again over the next couple of weeks, that's absolutely fine. Good luck with the projects.